Tonight we have Professor Dane Morrison. He is both a good friend and a crackerjack historian. He is Professor Emeritus of American History at Salem State University. He's been president of New England Historic Association. He's graduated from Boston College and Tufts, where he got his Ph.D. He's written extensively, including A Praying People, Massachusetts Acculturation and the Failure of Puritan Mission, and then Two Yankees, which he talked about here several years ago, The South Seas and the Discovery of American Identity. And then more recently, he wrote Eastward of Good Hope, Early America in a Dangerous World, which we would have had him speak if it were not for COVID. And hopefully we'll have him back for his upcoming book, which is Yankees Abroad, Critical Themes in World History. So please join me in welcoming Dane Morrison.
Top just came back. You just slide the mouse down a little bit. It should hopefully it'll disappear. Right.
Sorry.
Yep. That is.
Okay, we'll try that. But you still can applaud for Dane.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see you all. And thank you for people on Zoom tuning in. I especially want to thank Tom and Don Marchison and the staff of the Athenaeum for organizing this wonderful series. There are some really good lectures coming up, probably better than this one. So I look forward to those. Also, it is, of course, appropriate to talk about the revolution coming to the Seacoast on tax day.
Yes.
A reminder. When Seacoast people talk about the revolution, this image comes to mind. We think of the 1774 raid on Fort William and Mary, what people here call the real opening event of the revolution. Tonight, we're going to talk about what led up to the revolution and to this raid. We want to focus on the question, why? Why did they fight? Why had, according to the Patriot minister and then president of King's College in New York, why had a happily situated people decided to hazard their fortunes, their lives, and their souls in such a rebellion? John Adams, in 1818, toward the end of his life, was asked this question, probably repeatedly, and he famously observed, the revolution commenced before the war. The revolution was in the hearts and the minds of the people. And I would add, the revolution came about in their words, in a changed vocabulary, in a new language, in what we might call a language of resistance. We wanted to know how we went from Samuel Langdon's sermon called Joy and Gratitude to God for the long life of a good king, which he preached in Portsmouth in 1759 on the 76th birthday of King George II. How did we go from this language of obedience and submission to 10 years later, the language of our neighbor in Boston, Harbottle Door? I love his name. Harbottle Door, describing the jealousies the great uneasinesses, the vast difficulties, and the cruel treatment of the colonies by the detestable acts of Parliament against the brave, strenuous, and noble actions of the freeborn British Americans in opposition to these said acts and oppressions, and in defense of the natural constitution and charter rights of this people. How did we go from a language of submission and obedience to a language of resistance? The Seacoast Revolution was a revolution of farmers and fishermen. It was a revolution of what my colleague Chris Magra calls the fisherman's cause. Lying beneath the fish flakes and furrows of Portsmouth, Hampton, Rye, Newcastle, and their dependent rural enclaves, Durham, Stratham, Newmarket, lived fishermen and shipbuilders, oystermen and merchants, sailors, and farmers and shopkeepers, all of whose lives were tied to the waters, the currents, the waves, the bays, the coves, and harbors of the Atlantic Ocean, and whose communities had harbored deep traditions of resistance that reached back hundreds of years. This was a people who had a tradition of rising up against royal authority when it threatened their livelihoods, their communities, their families. Now it's customary to think of the chronology of the revolution following what the Declaration of Independence called a long train of abuses. But in fact, the Seacoast Revolution was played out against a different, more maritime-oriented set of events. And so, if you pick up a textbook, you'll read about the Proclamation of 63, the Revenue Act of 64, the Currency Act, and so on. For these fishermen and merchants and oystermen, the chronology is more or less the same, but there are some things that are different. And so we pay more particular attention to the writs of assistance. We pay more attention to the Pine Tree Riot, the Seacoast Tea Resistance, New England Trade and Fisheries Acts, events that most people have not heard of, but that mattered and mattered greatly to the people of this area. So again, we ask why? Why did they rise up? Why did this revolution come about here? In 1760, a new king was crowned and new policies began to unravel and upset the rhythm of life on the seacoast. When George III became king at age 22, let's ponder that. King of England, Scotland, Ireland, and some 22 colonies scattered around the world. I have a 20-year-old. Let's talk again about how to do the laundry. George III became king. Great Britain was locked in another of a series of worldwide wars of empire. In this French and Indian War, George came to the throne as Britain had been losing to France and verging into bankruptcy. And so the king ordered a reassessment of the costs of the empire. When the report came back, George III was not a happy king. He learned that Britain was spending nearly 400,000 pounds sterling yearly in administering the colonies, at the same time that the colonies were sending back only 100,000 pounds. It was costing, this is not how empires are supposed to work, by the way. It was costing Britain 4 times as much to run the colonies as Britain was getting back. It was supposed to be reversed. And so he set out to impose new policies and new regulations that would reduce the costs of the American provinces and increase the amount that they would contribute to the empire. But how? How would he go about doing this? Well, let's start with the writs of assistance. Writs of assistance were search warrants that were issued during times of war to prevent smuggling. And they allowed customs agents to search for smuggled goods anywhere and at any time. So on ships, but also in warehouses, in shops, even in homes. In 1760, the newly appointed collector of customs in Salem, one James Cockle, petitioned the new king to issue a new round of writs of assistance. This was the height of the French and Indian War, and Cockle was convinced that local merchants were engaged in smuggling to the French in Canada. He was determined to put an end to this, and so he began what I would call a kind of reign of terror for seacoast merchants and mariners. He started immediately and issued periodically, this is what you would see in the newspapers of the seacoast area, warnings. Okay. Whereas it has been represented that many vessels trading to the plantations in the West Indies that do not belong to the King of Great Britain are returning with cargoes of rum, sugar, molasses, and they have found means to smuggle the same into His Majesty's colonies without paying the king's duty. Okay, it's important to remember that the taxes that Americans pay to the British Empire largely came in the form of import and export taxes called duties. Okay. Portsmouth officials followed rather quickly after, that's the right one, warning all vessels that they must stop at the customs house in Portsmouth before proceeding up the Piscataqua River. But it went beyond warnings. Okay. Cockle immediately set out breaking into warehouses in Salem, Marblehead, the North Shore of Massachusetts, Essex County area. And here we see this is an auction of goods taken from a warehouse. And he had the Navy's revenue cutters stop fishing schooners and other vessels at sea. Okay, here we see the auction of a fishing schooner called the Industrious Apprentice. Not just the schooner, which had been captured by British revenue cutters, but also, see if I can do this right, her boats, tackle, apparel, and appurtenances seized by James Cockle, collector of His Majesty's customs in the said province for breach of the Acts of Trade, and also 2 chests of tea, 10 coils of cordage, 7 bolts of duck cloth, also taken. Okay. This is what you see in the 1760s. Periodically, these notices in newspapers of auctions of goods taken by the customs officials from warehouses or off of ships. The fishing boat Samuel, same thing. The boat, as well as her tackle, apparel, furniture, and appurtenances, were taken and sold. Here we see the Barcelona, another fishing schooner, taken. Portsmouth fishermen and merchants. This all created concern because even though it's largely based on the North Shore of Massachusetts, people begin to wonder, how will this affect our trade up here? Could Cockle's reach extend up to the Piscataqua? Would customs revenue cutters stop New Hampshire vessels and seize them? Who would be next? Well, next would be the Brigantine Resolution, which anchored in Portsmouth Harbor and was stopped by Portsmouth Customs Collector George Meserve. He seized the Resolution and the 100 barrels of molasses that the captain neglected to report. Mere oversight. And then something interesting and something ominous happens. 4 days later, under the midnight moon of October 29th, and this is the newspaper report, a numerous company of men in disguise, armed with clubs, boarded the vessel, confined the officers, and spirited away the cargo. This would presage the Boston Tea Party of 1773 and the raid on Fort William and Mary in December of 1774. Let's stop for a moment and ask, so what? What did it mean for a fisherman, a merchant, a mariner to lose a boat, its tackle, apparel, and appurtenances, as we read in the newspaper reports? Well, on the seacoast, it meant the loss of liberty. It meant the loss of your freedom. Like land for a farmer, a boat meant liberty. Okay. Whether you measure it in land or you measure it in boats and tackle, property conferred 4 benefits on a person. First, economic independence. Land meant freedom. A boat meant freedom. Okay. If you work for someone else, if you're dependent on someone else for your livelihood, well, the word they had for an employer was master. The word they had for an employee was slave. You belonged. Your livelihood belonged to that person. You were not independent. You were dependent. Second benefit, if you had a boat or land, that independence earned you the respect of your neighbors, your community, your friends. It also gave you their political voice. If you had property, you earned the right to vote, to serve on town committees, and to serve in town offices. And last, you knew that you could provide for your family, you could provide for your children. And if you didn't have a boat, and if you didn't have land, you couldn't be certain of much of anything in this world. Property was liberty. Property was freedom. And not just the fishermen, but so many members of the community, the barrel makers, the rope makers, the merchants, and so on. Virtually the entire community depended on each fisherman, each merchant, and so on.
Salem.
Now, in Portsmouth, things weren't as bad as in Salem immediately. Okay.
Can you see us?
Portsmouth officials
What?
governed
Yeah.
with a somewhat gentler hand. Governor Benning Wentworth on our left was very busy with his own campaign of corruption, acquiring land throughout the province, and he was happy to collude with the merchants as long as he supported his endeavors. Meanwhile, the port's naval officer, John Fisher, and he becomes collector of customs in 1765. Fisher was away much of the time trying to make connections with influential members of parliament. I don't know very much about that part of our story, but we're very fortunate to have the expert on John Fisher. Our own Tom Hardiman has written a brilliant book, a wonderful book on the customs officials, especially Fisher. And I believe there are a few copies for sale at the back. Okay, but by April of 1768, the New Hampshire Gazette is warning an evil day is at hand. Goes on to note, on Saturday last, a lighter was coming from Salem to Boston with a quantity of molasses and brandy on board. She was seized by a man of war, British warship, and with the greatest expedition had the molasses and brandy carried on board the man of war, which gave, I love the language, which gave great uneasiness to the people at Boston. An evil day is at hand. On April 30th, 1773. So these reports keep coming out. For instance, on April 30th, 1773, the New Hampshire Gazette reports, last Friday, we had another specimen of the insolence of office when our partner, big with a writ of assistance, presumed to break over several warehouses on the Long Wharf on pretense that he had information of contraband goods being lodged there, which was not the case. We say on pretense, for it is only a dirty fellow who would be induced to tell such a customs officer that there is seizable goods in any stores, and they will be immediately broken open and exposed. Nay, the said Mr. Searcher was the title of a customs officer. Mr. Searcher boasted he had a right to make free work with our own bedchambers as with a ship or warehouse. Thus we see, now again, listen to how the language has changed from a language of submission and obedience. Thus we see what a monster in this writ of assistance is entrusted to the customs house. We see the wisdom of those provinces which has not suffered such a monster of monsters to prowl about their streets for prey. It is thought that this wanton and affronted behavior was with a design to excite protests and opposition to the work. And so a pretense for the return of guardacostas. A guardacosta was the Coast Guard of the Spanish colonies in Central and South America. They were notorious for their ill treatment, their cruel treatment of English prisoners. So the use of guardacosta here is to provoke that idea of an unbridled, all too free set of government officials. Now, people certainly expected, people on the Seacoast certainly expected that these customs collectors were taking a little off the top, that they were engaged in corruption. And in 1764, the accusations became public. I'm not going to read this, it's a little blurry, but in essence, one of James Costell's, remember he's the Salem Customs Commissioner, one of James Costell's, Cockle's own secretaries turned him in right before the Salem court and testified that Cockle was skimming off the top. Okay. And not only that, a few years later, the New Hampshire Gazette reported that Cockle had been implicated not just once, but several times. Cockle had been implicated of a bribe that he took nearly a year after which, when his corruption was detected, he was called to account by his supervisors. Both he and the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Francis Bernard, were in cahoots.
Right.
Now, they insisted that, yes, they did take 1,500 pounds sterling. This is a lot of money. They did indeed take 1,500 pounds sterling, but it was only a deposit, not a bribe. And they meant to return it, they just forgot.
Right.
In the same 1773, about the same time actually, the Massachusetts Spy reported, it is said that as describing the sailing of a ship from Boston, it is said that a quantity of silver to the amount of $30,000, this would have been Spanish silver dollars, was shipped on board from the custom house here, being part of the revenue money, which has so long been complained of as being unconstitutionally taken from us. When they use the word constitution, when they complain that something has been taken away unconstitutionally, now they're talking about rights, the rights of Englishmen. This is not just political, this is constitutional. This is not just a problem, this is a crisis. This
Between political and
of the loss of constitutional
I
rights
understand any of this.
our bottom door reported. This it's what
It's all the same old shit that's been going on for years.
well,
on
the
April
Brits
5th of
were
1760.
using their office to just steal.
The next shoe drops as Parliament passed the Revenue Act of 1764, what we call the Sugar Act or the Plantation Act. Now, this act stipulated it is just and necessary that a revenue be raised in America for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the colonies.
Because the French and Indian War was fought and it cost a lot of money.
This taxation is interesting because they actually lowered the tax from 6 cents a barrel of molasses, only 3 cents. You don't usually see people protest when their taxes are lowered. But see, the taxes would be collected on sugar, molasses, and rum, cut in the West Indies by enslaved people. Okay, on the duties that would be paid by ships entering Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Portsmouth. And, excuse me. And anyone caught smuggling goods would be tried no longer by a jury of their peers. This is a fundamental right that goes back to the Magna Carta of 1215. They would no longer be tried by a jury of their peers in Boston or Portsmouth. Now they would be taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia. You would have to pay to get up there. You would have to pay for lodging. You'd have to find a lawyer. And if you were found guilty, your ship would be confiscated. The cargo would be confiscated. The Admiralty judges, 3 of them from the British Navy, the Admiralty judges would receive 1/3 of the proceeds of the auction. I want that job. As one historian notes, the act was especially problematic for merchants in places like Portsmouth, who depended on the lucrative commerce of the West Indies trade. Now, we get a sense of what this meant and the language through which the Seacoast people understood what was happening to them. We get a sense of this in an essay that was published in several newspapers of the time in May of June 1765, called Observations on the Proposed American Tax so far as relates to the continental colonies and the effect thereof on the trade and navigation of Great Britain. Okay. The essay was about a column and a half. It dealt with 2 issues. First, the idea that we had not contributed to these wars of empire, especially the French and Indian, was preposterous and indeed insulting. It read that the war with France begun in 1744. In this war, the New England colonies, at great peril of their utmost impoverishment and distress, had sent legions of men into battle and had captured several French strongholds. According to one historian, of all the New England colonies, New Hampshire actually suffered the most from the loss of life in these colonies, these wars, and from taxation, paying for the wars. New Hampshire men served at Lake George in 1755. They served at Fort William Henry in 1756. In 1757, in the famous massacre at Fort William and Henry, trying to think what is the movie, Last of the Mohegans. You see a representation of this massacre in the Michael Mann film, Last of the Mohegans. 80 of the 200 New Hampshire men stationed there, 80 of them were slaughtered. Okay. They participated in the capture of Louisburg in 1758 and Havana, Cuba in 1762. New Hampshire men comprised Rogers Rangers and marched with Colonel John Stark. In fact, in 1759 alone, in that 1 year, 1/3 of all able-bodied males of military age in New Hampshire were serving in the British military. New Hampshire had reason to suspect that the reason a revenue must be raised to defend them lay somewhere else. The essay went on to summarize New England's maritime concerns. They focused on Massachusetts in this particular essay, that several of these colonies have no staple commodity except for fish and lumber.
Yes.
Massachusetts alone purchased 600,000 pounds of goods from Great Britain and only had fish to pay for it. Same with New Hampshire. Okay. The Massachusetts fisheries employed about 1,500 sailor vessels, generally small, and upwards of 13,000 men, boys included, mostly employed in the cotton industry. New Hampshire didn't have as many vessels and as many people in the fishing industry, but almost as many. Okay. Well, year after year, there's a drumbeat of new policies and new regulations. In 1765, it's the Stamp Act. Tensions rose and reactions escalated. The language, again, reflected what was happening in the Seacoast. Okay. It's a little confusing. Basically, the idea was that this is our way of representing those stamps. The idea was that colonists would be required to purchase stamps for paper that they used. Now, in the textbooks, they say it was about $1 per stamp. Actually, it was a lot more complicated than that. It was like a modern tax code. For instance, the act stipulated that the highest tax of £10 would be placed on attorney licenses. Other court papers, okay, were taxed in amounts varying from 3 cents to 10 shillings. Land grants under £100 were taxed at 1 shilling 6 pence, and then varying amounts for greater amounts of land, and so on and so on. Newspapers and pamphlets, a penny for a single sheet, and $1 shilling for every sheet in pamphlets or papers selling more than 1 sheet. Most newspapers were 4 sheets. So you're paying, the British government for your local newspaper. My particular favorite was, in their wisdom, Parliament decided that they would include dice and playing cards under the category of paper. Now, you all know the adage, the political adage of dividing your enemies and conquering them. This was one of the worst political calculations you can imagine, because what the Parliament did was unite 3 sectors of American society. First, lawyers, merchants, ministers, people who use reams and reams and reams of paper, and who were quite articulate in presenting a protest, in mounting a defense. They knew how to write, and write convincingly. Secondly, this would hit farmers and fishermen, the largest sector of American society, who needed paper for land sales and any number of activities. And last, longshoremen and sailors, the youngest and the most violent sector of colonial society. And so, when the New Hampshire Gazette publishes an essay on August 30, I should have said, I'm sorry, let me clarify. So the bill was passed in Parliament on March 18th of 1765. It was set to go into effect November 1st, 1765. Another miscalculation. Parliament is giving the colonists time to organize. And it's during this period that they organize groups like longshoremen. They organize longshoremen and sailors who will come together in mobs to storm the customs houses. When you organize a mob, you want to give them a label, a name, and you don't want to call them the dirty, violent, young delinquents. The You call them something like the Sons of Liberty. And that's what they were called. Okay. So when you read, or if you can't read, you have read to you from the New Hampshire Gazette, it is not enough for tyrants to have consumed mankind so fast that out of 20 parts they have within 2,000 years destroyed perhaps 19 parts of our wealth. But now, and again the language, fresh machines of cruelty are still sought after. Okay. And so we find on September 12th, 1765, in Portsmouth, citizens come together and they hang the customs commissioner, George Meserve, again, George Meserve, in effigy. He had actually, on his return from England, he had already resigned. That wasn't enough. They wanted in Portsmouth, remember, there's no CNN, there's no breaking news. They want a very public resignation. They want people to see it for themselves. And so Meserve resigns. The crowd hung a figure alongside of Meserve of the British Prime Minister, Grenville, responsible for the Stamp Act, and another depicting the devil, whom the citizens said created taxes in the first place. On the last day of October, just before the Stamp Act is due to go into effect. Okay. The New Hampshire Gazette appears with a black border around it, an emblem of mourning for the loss of liberty. The printer says he cannot publish it any longer. He cannot submit to an unjust tax. And then on November 1st, a funeral over the goddess of liberty on account of the Stamp Act. It goes on and on. I want to jump ahead in the interest of time, the Boston Tea Party, which we think of as a local event, a Boston event. But in fact, a number of New Hampshire seaport towns anticipated this protest. And they held meetings, the town meetings the day before. The Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party takes place the evening of December 16th. In New Hampshire, town meetings are taking place on December 15th, the day before. Apparently they knew something was up. Some in New Hampshire, towns like Dover, Barrington, Exeter, Hampton, Newcastle, if for some reason even Haverhill up north on the Connecticut River, and of course Portsmouth, passed what they called tea resolutions. So I want to take a look at what they said. I want us to think about the language that they used. So here's the Portsmouth Town meeting on the morning of December 16th. What did they resolve? It appears manifestly that this latter act was artfully designed by the ministry for the express purpose of raising a net revenue from the colonies by the authority of the British Parliament only. Well, who's supposed to raise taxes? Right? Not Parliament. Parliament can raise taxes on people in England, but it's your own legislature, with your own representatives, with your neighbors. Only the New Hampshire legislature is supposed to have the authority to raise taxes on New Hampshire people. This was stipulated in the New Hampshire Charter. The same was true for the other 12 colonies. This is critical. They're not opposing paying taxes. They're opposing who has the authority. to raise those taxes. For 150 years, only the New Hampshire legislature had the authority to raise taxes on New Hampshire people. And again, who's in the New Hampshire legislature? Your neighbors, people from your community, some of whom are your friends, people who understood, was this a good fishing season? Were many boats lost at sea? Was there a drought? Were some towns unable to pay their full complement of taxes? People who knew what conditions were like here, not a set of peers 3,000 miles away who knew nothing about conditions in New Hampshire. Okay, by the authority of the British Parliament, without our consent. Wherefore, from a due sense of the value and importance of our liberties and our properties, and from just apprehensions of the horrors of slavery, we are induced to make the following results. That the measures pursued of late by the Ministry of Great Britain in their attempt to subject the colonies to taxation by the sole authority of the British Parliament. We are bound by our love of the nation of which we are members to oppose such measures to the utmost of our power. It is the natural right of men to have the power of disposing of their own property, either by themselves or their representatives. That the act of the British Parliament laying a duty upon teas landed in America, payable here, is a tax, whereby the property of Americans is taken from them without their consent. You're hearing the same ideas over and over and over again, because apparently the stubborn thickheads in England don't get it. I would submit to you, this is as eloquent as anything Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, that every virtuous and public-spirited freeman ought steadfastly to oppose to the utmost of his ability every artful attack of the ministry to enslave Americans. Again, the word slavery has important connotations here. If you are a fisherman and you've had a bad haul this season, you can't afford to pay taxes. What do you sell? Your nets, your tackle, your boat? Do you fall into dependence in which you now have to work for someone else? You are no longer a freeman. You're no longer independent. You are, in the language of their time, enslaved. That the power given by Parliament to the British East India Company is a direct attack upon the liberties of America, and it is the indispensable duty of all true-hearted Americans to render this effort abortive. Well, all of our towns around here in the Seacoast met in town meetings at this time, and they all passed resolves. I was going to read the Hampton resolves. I hope they read just the same as the Portsmouth resolves. It's the same language, but in the interest of time, Tom will want me to move on, won't you, Tom? And so I'd like to see if we get one more in. And that is this one. The year 1775 was the year of confirmation. A month before the battles of Lexington and Concord, in fact, 2 weeks before the battles of Lexington and Concord, Parliament passed another of these measures. They called it the New England Trade and Fisheries Act. And Lord North was the driving force behind it. Okay. What this proposes, like the coercive acts, is to close the New England fisheries, using British warships to patrol the coastline and simply close the fisheries. He claimed that this would force New Englanders to pay for the $9,000 worth of tea, 9,000 pounds worth of tea that the Bostonians had dumped. But privately, in private meetings in Parliament, he said, we are going to punish those rebels. This was not just a financial piece of legislation. This was an act of punishment. Okay. He wanted to bring the rebels to their knees, and he had no problem saying that privately. And so this is what leads us up to the attack, the raid on Fort William and Mary in December 1770. So I thank you for your time. Well, I wonder if anybody has any questions.
I got it.
Go yours.
No problem.
I will get yours.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I read that on the attack on Fort William and Mary, none of the British were injured. And then I read at one point that the commander-in-chief actually was wounded. Have you heard either one of those, or?
There are lots of stories. I think there were I think there were 7 soldiers, some of them were hospitalized. I think the commander might have been pushed around a little bit. He wasn't all that interested in surrendering the fort. So, but I don't think the wounds were terribly severe. Yeah. Please, sir.
In my understanding is in Massachusetts, one of the concerns about going to taking the power of taxation away from the colony
Mhm.
and giving it to the crown meant the crown would be paying the crown officials, the governor and whatnot in Massachusetts. Was that also a concern here?
Yeah,
in the
it
future?
was. In fact, there had been a measure passed by Parliament that took, this is an ironic one. Massachusetts wants to pay its own officials. They want to raise taxes to pay their own judges and such. Now, again, most people don't want to see their taxes raised, and they're always concerned about how much is the governor making and how much are these judges making. But if Parliament is paying the judges, then the judges are working for Parliament.
Right.
And the fear, the concern, the suspicion is that then the judges will be more likely to do the bidding of Parliament. There are a number of people who are from New Hampshire and Massachusetts and so on taking these jobs. But a number of people, especially among the customs service, were what were called placemen. They were Englishmen who wanted an office, a place. They wanted an office in the colonies. They weren't paid a lot of money. And the understanding was that they would use this place, they would use this office, however they wanted to gain more money, and that would supplement their income. And so they were rather avaricious and rather indifferent to sort of the niceties of the office. So yeah, there was a great deal of concern about who is paying for the judges. In effect, who are the judges beholden to? Great question. Yes, sir. Anyone? Sorry.
I was wondering, with all these various taxes that they imposed, were they imposed solely on colonies, or were there similar taxes that they imposed on?
Wonderful question, because remember what we said was that there were about George III oversaw some 22 colonies scattered around the world. But these taxes were not imposed on the British East India Company in India. They weren't imposed on the slave trading posts in Africa. And they were not imposed on the colonies in the West Indies. They were imposed almost entirely on the 13 colonies. And so for that reason, we felt kind of singled out. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was it Franklin that said at one point, why didn't they just tell us how much they needed and let us decide amongst ourselves how to raise it?
That's how it was supposed to work. It might have been Franklin. I don't know the answer to your question. Was it Franklin who said this? But it was how things were supposed to work. The Board of Trade was supposed to, in effect, not exactly, but in effect, send a tax bill to each of the colonies. The colonies would, through their House of Representatives, decide how that tax would be collected. They wanted the authority to collect the tax themselves. There was never a sense of shirking. In fact, something like 10% of Massachusetts men aged 16 and up were killed during the French and Indian War, those who served. There were enormous numbers of colonists who did not make it out alive. There were enormous, even larger numbers who came back with what we would call post-traumatic stress syndrome or physical injuries. You would see a lot of injured people roaming the streets of Portsmouth or Newmarket or Hampton in these years. They wanted, there's a great film called Shame from 1955 or so, in which Alan Ladd asks a farmer for a drink of water. Now the farmer's holding a shotgun on him, as the farmer doesn't trust him. And Shane says, I'll leave when you lower your shotgun. And the farmer says, what difference does it make? And Shane says, I want this to be my idea. That's the answer to your question. The colonists wanted the collection of taxes to be their idea. They wanted to do it themselves. There was another question in back.
Yeah, just to follow up on the distinction between the other colonies and the American colonies. So you started your comments by saying when George III became king, he commissioned a study of the colonies, and that the American colonies were losers financially.
Yeah,
Was that true of the Caribbean and the other?
Caribbean's different for a couple of reasons. One, Europe had a sweet tooth, and sugar, molasses, and rum, 3 basic food groups. Provided a great deal of tax revenue.
Yeah.
For the British Empire, a great deal of tax revenue. And so they weren't seen as shirkers. But there's another element to your point. The plantation owners in the Sugar Islands, British Sugar Islands, didn't necessarily stay there. They made so much money, they bought seats in Parliament. So you've got these sugar planters in Parliament influencing the legislation to say, not us, don't tax us, tax us pesky New Englanders. Does that make sense, the way I describe them? So, yeah. Tom?
Just another quick point is that one of the other issues with the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts is that they were payable only in hard currencies. And
Right.
most of the New England economy ran on notes of credit.
Yep. Yeah. So where do you find English pound sterling if you're a farmer in Newmarket or Newfields? Yeah. Are there any other questions this evening? Thank you all for your time.